The 2005 Australian horror film, WOLFE CREEK, is a critically acclaimed movie that was written and directed by Greg McLean and starred Nathan Phillips, Cassandra and Kestie Morassi. In this frightening flick, our main characters are three backpackers travelling around Australia. Their intentions of travelling to a popular Australian landmark known as WOLFE CREEK, a real meteorite crater in Western Australia, turns horribly wrong when their vehicle breaks down and are taken captive by the xenophobic and deadly outback serial killer, MICK TAYLOR, played by John Jarratt. The film claims to be inspired by true events, and today we are going to explore one of those real-life, horrifying stories. The case of Bradley John Murdoch, Outback Murderer. The case of Bradley John Murdoch is one of horrifying proportions and led to one of the inspirations behind the terrifying 2005 Australian horror film, WOLFE CREEK. This real-life account is something out of a nightmare and akin to that of a Hollywood movie script. The case involves two British backpackers who were travelling around Australia, who were attacked by a deranged criminal. One tourist was murdered, while the other managed to escape. Our story begins with two lovers, British tourists, PETER FALCONIO, 29, and JOANNE LEES, 28, in 2001. Peter and JOANNE had begun a relationship some years earlier, while Peter was studying at Brighton University. As most young people do, they planned a big overseas trip in early 2000, with many countries on their list. On November the 15th, 2000, the travel-loving couple embarked on a trip through Southeast Asia, stopping off in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Thailand. As a means of extending their stay, the couple decided to take a working holiday in Australia. By the 16th of January 2001, the couple had arrived in Sydney on a working holiday visa. After working for 5 months, with JOANNE working at a bookstore in Sydney, Peter had managed to secure a Volkswagen T2 orange combi campervan for the next part of their journey. The couple had planned a road trip around Australia, starting from Sydney, heading south to Melbourne, then along to Adelaide, and then heading north to Darwin, and ending the trip in Brisbane. On the 25th of June, the pair departed for their road trip of Australia. 2 weeks later, after leaving Adelaide in South Australia, Peter and JOANNE headed north on the STUART HIGHWay, a long stretch of road that extends from Port Augusta in South Australia, right through the centre of the continent, and finally ending in Darwin in the north of Australia. STUART HIGHWay is so long and sparsely populated with small towns throughout, with a few tourist sites along the way. It's not unusual for people driving along this epic road to have no contact with other human beings or seeing another car for a few days. Peter and JOANNE's plan was to travel to a popular tourist spot known as Uluru, or Ayers Rock, and use the nearby town of Alice Springs as a home base for a couple of nights. After settling in Alice Springs to recruit supplies and have their combi looked at by a mechanic, as apparently it was pulling to one side whilst driving, the pair headed back onto STUART HIGHWay and drove north. Alice Springs was the last major stop until Darwin, over 1,000 miles away. On Saturday the 14th of July 2001, Peter and JOANNE drove north on the STUART HIGHWay, stopping at a small settlement called Tree to refuel their vehicle. They stopped briefly to watch the beautiful outback sunset and then continued driving. Around 7:30 p.m, Peter and JOANNE were travelling down the long stretch of road bound north in their orange combi. Falconio was driving, and Lee sat next to him in the passenger seat. It was at this time the couple had noticed a car's headlights tracking closer behind them. They had been aware of this vehicle, and it had been following them since they stopped earlier at a roadhouse in Barrow Creek. The vehicle drew closer and closer. The pair expected that the vehicle, a white four-wheel drive ute, was going to overtake them. However, the vehicle drove up alongside them and matched their speed. Peter and JOANNE looked over at the car. The driver turned his cab lights on and started making strange gestures at them. The man then gestured at the back end of the pair's combi campervan and motioned at them to pull over. Peter, fearing something was wrong with the vehicle, pulled over on the side of the isolated highway. Falconio stopped the engine as the other vehicle pulled up behind the combi. He told JOANNE to stay in the car as he got out to go and speak to the other driver. JOANNE heard Peter talking to the other man, who looked around 40 years old, shoulder-length hair, sporting a handlebar moustache and a trucker's cap. The man explained he had seen sparks shooting out of the van's exhaust. Peter thanked the man and went to the driver's side of the vehicle and told Joanne to jump in the driver's seat and rev the engine. He then grabbed some cigarettes and walked to the rear of the vehicle to investigate. Peter yelled at Joanne to start the engine. She did, and then she heard a loud. Moments later, the man was at the driver's side window pointing a silver handgun at her. The gunman began yelling at her. Joanne was in complete shock. The man forced the door open, switched the engine off, took the keys, and pointed the gun at Joanne's forehead. He forced her into the passenger seat and yelled at her to put her arms behind her back and pushed her head under the dash. The man tied her hands together using a series of black cable ties. He tried to secure her legs together, but Joanne was fighting off the man. After unsuccessfully trying to tie her feet together and taping her mouth, the crazed gunman ran to the passenger side of the vehicle, opened the door, and ripped Joanne out of the car. Dragging her to his four-wheel drive utility truck parked behind, Joanne noticed a dog in the other vehicle. She screamed for Peter's help. There was no answer. Joanne pleaded with her captor, who growled at her to shut up. The madman dragged Joanne to the back of the truck, which was covered with a green canopy. He tossed her in under the cover and left. A few moments later, Joanne, fearing rape, managed to slide her way to the edge of the truck, put her feet over the edge, and jumped out, quickly making a desperate run into the open land and shrubbery of the outback. Just like in a horror film, where the protagonist is trying to escape, she fell a few times, managing to pick herself up and keep running for as long as she could. Eventually finding some shrubs to hide in, she laid quiet, fearing the worst. The gunman was relentless and began to search for Joanne with a torch and his dog. As he searched for some time, coming very close to where Joanne was lying, she saw the light of the torch hit the shrubbery just above her head. The man walked towards her, hearing his footsteps in the dirt. She buried her head down further. The footsteps stopped just before the shrub. Joanne waited, silently. After a few moments, which felt like an eternity to Joanne, the footsteps started again, this time hearing them walk away from where she was hiding. Too afraid to leave, she kept there, and luckily she did, for the gunman would reappear near that site a further 3 times. After a long time, she heard the footsteps get fainter and fainter. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of the truck engine roar. Joanne lifted her head, hoping that the man was gone. She saw the lights of the vehicle turn, and they turned slowly in her direction. Ducking her head back down into the dirt and shrub, she listened patiently, hearing the sound of the Utes engine getting closer. It stopped momentarily, peering its headlights out over the dark desert landscape. Then it drove a little further off, stopping again, and then driving to another spot, only to do the same thing. After about half an hour of this, the white four-wheel drive drove away. Joanne, in complete shock, was unable to move, and perhaps luckily so, for the gunman would drive back down the same stretch of road a further 3 times, apparently looking for his escapee. Joanne lay, still, motionless in the cold. It was 11 degrees Celsius that night in the desert. She was wearing nothing more than a t-shirt and shorts. She lay there for 5 hours. At 12:35 a.m., Joanne heard the sound of an engine. It didn't sound like the same four-wheel drive from before. It sounded bigger, a lot bigger. Desperate for help, she leapt from her hiding place and ran towards the road. She saw a huge road train, a vehicle that is used to transport goods and materials along the outback highways. Joanne stood in the road and waved her cuffed hands above her head. The truck took a while to stop, for they are so long and heavy. She jumped out off the road and ran to the cab. Explaining her story to the truck drivers, they took her back to the nearest town of Barrow Creek. The Alice Springs police were called around 1:30 a.m. and arrived to collect evidence and testimonies at around 4:30 a.m. and commenced a search for Peter Falconio, accompanied by the road train driver, at around 7 a.m. Returning to the scene, they found a dirt-covered pool of blood and the couple's combi camper van hidden some 80 meters into the scrub. It was not until 8 hours later after the rescue that roadblocks were put in place on the 12 likely roads exiting the district. Police searches of the area in the following months revealed little except Lee's footprints. 4 Aboriginal trackers arrived from a nearby settlement within a few days, but none of them found evidence of either Falconio or the gunman. Given the unusual nature of the attack and the lack of corroborating evidence in the way of Peter's body or his belongings, it took the police some days to appreciate the significance of the crime. In later weeks, the media would begin to scrutinize Lees in the wake of her attack, pointing out inconsistencies in her story, her changing version of the perpetrator's facial composite, and the actual type of vehicle or dog. The media would also pick apart the outfit she wore at press outings, one in particular with Joanne wearing a t-shirt that has a printed slogan of "Cheeky Monkey," pointing out that it was distasteful in the wake of a supposed attack. What can be said in Lee's defense is that all her clothing and belongings were taken into police custody for evidence, and the little clothes she had were either borrowed or donated from friends or family. Police were able to retrieve CCTV footage from a nearby service station in Alice Springs from the night of the attack. The footage shows a man of Lee's description with shoulder-length hair, around the same age, a moustache, and wearing a cap. The CCTV footage also shows the vehicle of the man in the forecourt, a white four-wheel drive ute with a green canopy, a 1991 to 1999 model Toyota Land Cruiser. Police released the footage in the hopes that whoever was the owner would come forward to clear their name from suspicion. When this did not happen, police began to investigate all registered owners of this model. Based on the CCTV footage and the model and color of car, the police narrowed their search down to 36 suspects, one of whom was a Bradley John Murdoch. Murdoch was known to police previously through a history of unrelated charges, including drug running and possession of illegal firearms. A few years prior, Bradley was charged for shooting at a crowd of Aboriginal people who were celebrating at an Indigenous Australian rules football grand final match in the remote Kimberley region of Western Australia. He was sentenced for 21 months, but released after only serving 15 months. Murdoch was initially interviewed at his residence in Broome, a coastal tourist town in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, in November 2001. However, no DNA samples were collected. During this time, Bradley John Murdoch went into hiding. Police investigators tried alternative means of tying Murdoch to the assault on Lees and Falconio by contacting Murdoch's brother and collecting DNA from him. Murdoch's brother was more than compliant and helped police to track down Murdoch. On the 17th of May 2002, Murdoch's drug-running accomplice was apprehended. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he gave up Murdoch's whereabouts. On August the 22nd, 2002, Bradley John Murdoch was arrested and tried on another unrelated kidnap and assault charge by the South Australian Police. He was eventually acquitted of these charges, but with so much media scrutiny and publicity surrounding the case of Peter Falconio and JOANNE LEES, the state of the Northern Territory had Murdoch extradited in 2003. The case was heard before the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory in Darwin. The trial began on October the 17th, 2005. Murdoch pleaded not guilty to the charges of murder against Peter Falconio and assaulting and attempting to kidnap his girlfriend, JOANNE LEES. The trial ended on the 13th of December 2005 and saw Murdoch sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 28 years. He was also convicted of other assault-related charges on JOANNE LEES. The nightmare is now over for JOANNE. The sensational story of her attack and survival against all odds is one that only Hollywood scriptwriters could only dream of, making it one of the perfect inspirations for films like WOLFE CREEK and many others. One question has never been answered, even with pressure put on Bradley John Murdoch. The location of Peter Falconio's body has never been found. This has been an episode of Shadow Matter, and this is part 1 of the real-life stories that inspired the horror film WOLFE CREEK. Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to see more content like this. And also don't forget to hit that notifications bell. And together we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the Shadow Matter.